I'm Sara Denby. I head up the Unstereotype Alliance Secretariat at UN Women in New York. And I am here to talk to you about whether brands are failing Gen Z in the fight for gender equality. So clearly the light entertainment to start the day. But I promise you a couple of perspectives, some more data, and some takeaway tools in order to support such a brash statement. I do head up the Unstereotype Alliance, which is a global action platform. Do you want me to? All right. Is that better? Okay. The Unstereotype Alliance is a global action platform that seeks to eliminate harmful stereotypes and bias from all advertising and media content. It's a global movement of 240 organisations, advertisers, creative agencies, media platforms, industry associations that recognise that advertising content can shape perceptions of society and drive social change by depicting positive representations of all people. We work to empower people in all their diversity, so race, class, age, religion, ethnicity, education, sexuality, socioeconomic status. And we address the full gender spectrum, so LGBTIQ+, through to healthy masculinities. Which is why we were so excited to track the emergence of Gen Z, which doesn't even like to be labelled Gen Z, because labels in general are offensive and pigeonholes are reductive, and static gender identities shouldn't even be a thing. We get it. Gen Z has been touted as the first gender fluid generation. And as the Unstereotype Alliance also rejects stereotypes and any label that reduces entire groups of people to a simplistic set of characteristics or identities, we embrace this emerging generation that we shall call Gen Z for today and tomorrow as the most progressive generation of all time. And yet, there are disturbing trends that contradict this narrative. They have far more consequential impacts than offensive labelling, and brands can definitely play a role in perpetuating them. This is what we call the Gen Z gender paradox. Elsewhere, it's been called the new global gender divide. Young men and young women's worldviews are pulling apart. The consequences could be far-reaching. Earlier this year, you may have read a piece in the Financial Times that talked about one of the most well-established patterns in measuring public opinion, which is that every generation tends to move as one in terms of its politics and general ideology. Its members share the same formative experiences, reach life's big milestones at the same time, and intermingle in the same spaces. With Gen Z, however, they can be hyper-progressive on certain issues, but surprisingly conservative or traditional in others. The FT claims that Gen Z is undergoing a great gender divergence, with young women far more progressive and young men more conservative or traditional. Gen Z is two generations, not one. In countries on every continent, this ideological gap has opened up between young men and women. They no longer see eye to eye. In the US, Gallup data shows that for decades, young men and women were each spread roughly equally across liberal and conservative worldviews. Now, women aged 18 to 30 are 30 percentage points more liberal than their male peers. That gap took just 6 years to open up. But it's not just happening in the US. Here in the UK, there is now a 25-point gap between increasingly conservative young men and progressive female peers. And in Germany, the gap is 30 points. Outside the West, there are even more stark divisions, including South Korea, where there's a yawning chasm between young men and women, and it's a pattern we see replicated across China and Africa. And in every country, this dramatic split is either exclusive to Gen Z or it's far more pronounced than among men and women in their 30s and older. The Unstereotype Alliance and UN Women conduct a biennial survey called the Gender Equality Attitude Study. And sadly, we've identified the same ideological split occurring over the last few years. When you consider how that scales up and manifests in our communities, it becomes clear why we work so hard to eradicate harmful gender stereotypes. Now, you might be asking, what is going on with Gen Z? What is it that is driving this gap, these divergent attitudes and beliefs of what is supposed to be such a progressive generation, particularly when it comes to gender? Have those views not been left in the past? In short, no, they have not. We conduct our gender equality attitude study across 20 countries, and our data also shows that archaic attitudes towards gender equality still prevail. While 9 in 10 people agree that equal pay for equal work is important to their country's future success, 40% of male respondents agree that a man's job is to earn money, while a woman's job is to look after the house and family. 51% of men agree that women should work less and devote more time to caring for the family. And 19% of all respondents believe that there are acceptable circumstances for someone to hit their spouse or partner. But of greatest concern is the fact that these views are held most fervently among cohorts of young men, particularly aged 16 to 19. Traditional perceptions of gender are not dying out with older generations. What's more, they are being actively propagated amongst our young Gen Z men right across the globe. So what is happening here? The Me Too movement was certainly a key trigger, giving rise to fiercely feminist values among young women who suddenly felt empowered to speak out against long-running injustices. 7 years on, the clear divides on fundamental gender equality issues like sexual harassment has pushed young men and women into conservative and liberal camps respectively on many other issues. We've lost my slides. I'm sure they're onto it down the back. And the proliferation of smartphones and social media means that young men and women now, increasingly inhabit separate social spaces and experience separate cultures. We started to dig deeper, and there is a clear picture emerging. Men and boys are receiving many conflicting and unhealthy messages. They're feeling the pressure, and they're lacking positive role models. That has opened up a new and dangerous gap in the market, which predatory manfluencers have stepped right into, and they're making it so much worse. Their stereotypical toxic messages about what it means to be a successful man are harming our young men. They're suffering poor mental health, and suicide is now the leading cause of death for men under 50. This is a serious problem. Our young men are not okay. So what does this have to do with brands? Certainly in advertising, portrayals of masculinity in the media and advertising have become monolithic. The impact is widespread and it's significant, particularly for brands, because boys and young men are notoriously hard to reach. So once you have their attention, you have a responsibility and a duty of care with what you say to them. If we consider advertising as an inspirational vision of what we could all aspire to be, what role models are we presenting to young men and boys? What does it mean to be a man in 2024? Let's take a look.
How do men see success? Cars, bars, boats? No, not boats. Yachts. Lots and lots and lots of money, of honeys. Don't be funny, being fast. Ferrari, Lamborghini, Martini. Shaken, not stirred. Never, ever stirred. Always tough. Triceps, biceps, pecs. Sex. Lots and lots and lots of sex. Lots of success. Business. excess, careless, hairless, fearless, joyless, heartless, expressionless, humorless, relentless, emotionless, soulless success.
Once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? That video was put together by our Alliance member New Macho at BBD Perfect Storm here in London. And they also conducted a survey in the UK and the US called The Price of Success. They gathered opinions from 4,000 men aged 18 to 75 years old, and 66% of millennial men told them that advertising and the media have a negative impact on how successful they feel. This means that advertising and the media are making that many men feel worse about themselves. This finding was mirrored in younger Gen Z cohorts and tracks with the upward trajectory of stats you saw there on the rising rates of poor mental health in young men. And when we apply an intersectional lens with all the many layers of misrepresentation and bias that come with race, for example, the picture gets worse for consumers and for brands. A report from Adweekly found 70% of Black Gen Z consumers in the US say racial identity has increasingly become a central aspect of their self-identity, compared to only 39% of non-Black consumers. 42% of Black Gen Z consumers say they are more likely to buy from brands that actively confront and challenge racial and ethnic stereotypes. And yet, 31% of Black Gen Z consumers are dissatisfied with how their lives are portrayed in advertising. So, advertising and progressive storytelling has a huge role to play in changing this narrative for business and for good, which is why we exist. The Unstereotype Alliance was founded to address one of the most common defaults employed in advertising creative to quickly land an idea or a character: stereotypes. It's critical to consider the impact of this because advertising is such a far-reaching ecosystem supported by billions of dollars, and it influences consumers' views and perceptions all over the world of themselves and of those around them. On the flip side, progressive and inclusive advertising can obviously help create an enormous amount of good and drive positive social change. To be clear, a stereotype is an idea that undermines a group of people in wider culture and is generally accepted and propagated by many, even if it isn't true or grounded in any reality. Stereotypes stand back to back with discrimination, and they act as a barrier to progress in every society. We can think about stereotypes as a kind of gateway belief because they have a strong relationship with prejudice and discrimination, which is why they're so destructive in our societies. Stereotypes inform prejudices because they give us a baseline for having certain feelings about different groups of people, and then these prejudices inform discrimination because we start to act in a way that excludes or lessens opportunities for whole groups of people. And that's a big deal from a human rights perspective. Because when we diminish and disregard entire groups of people, there are real life consequences that come from that, like reduced education and employment opportunities, poor economic and health outcomes, discriminatory policy decisions, and denial of individual rights, like bodily autonomy. Ultimately, stereotypes create harmful norms that contravene an individual's right to live a fully empowered and decent life. They are never just a joke. And they're culturally driven, so they show up differently all around the world, which is why the Unstereotype Alliance has 12 national chapters that tackle stereotypes specific to that particular market at a local level. But of course, tackling stereotypes is always easier said than done. And as with most things, it's uncertainty that immobilizes us. Last year at Cannes Lions, we launched a global campaign to mobilise public action against stereotypes by reaching, educating and engaging the billions of consumers that our members serve. Say Nothing, Change Nothing was aimed at Gen Z and encouraged people to be active upstanders, not bystanders, when they see stereotypes in action. But like any good campaign, we started with consumer insights and conducted a global survey to understand what it is that holds people back from speaking up against stereotypes. While 3 out of 4 people say they regularly see or hear stereotyping in action, 50% do not speak up or disagree when they see someone using a negative stereotype because they don't want to escalate the situation. And 41% of people don't know how to intervene. They don't know what to say or how to call out stereotypes. And so they say nothing. The problem is that if we keep seeing these stereotypes around us, reflected back to us, not only do we change nothing, but we become desensitized to them and we normalize them. So you can imagine when these outdated attitudes proliferate in advertising and media content, it becomes clear why it's so crucial that we eradicate harmful stereotypes. And yet, our gender equality attitude study tells us 68% of people believe the media still portrays women in traditional roles, so wife, mother, homemaker, caregiver. And 73% believe that men are still depicted in traditional roles as business leaders, providers, decision makers. Now, if portrayals shape perceptions, and we think of advertising and media as drivers of social attitudes and beliefs, what impact do you think this is having on the fight for gender equality? And if you're thinking, well, that's a really binary analysis and Gen Z is gender fluid, no wonder this doesn't resonate with them. We test thousands of ads from some of the world's most progressive brands with our unstereotype metric. And in 2023, only 3% of ads featured people from the LGBTIQ+ community. And that's not the only community woefully underrepresented. Just 1% of ads featured someone living with a disability, yet 15% of the world's population lives with a physical or mental disability. That's not a minority. These are the outdated attitudes that proliferate still in advertising and media content. This is what Gen Z sees reflected back at them as the world they live in. It's not inclusive, it's not diverse, it's not progressive. No wonder there's a gender paradox. No wonder they're divided. So, what can you do as content creators and as brands? You have the power to drive change in our communities, in your communities and your social networks through progressive and inclusive advertising and all kinds of content that feature authentic portrayals of all people. You have the power to shift cultures and normalize equality of all kinds, empowering people of all genders and generations through positive representation. And now here's the takeaways I promised. Safely confronting and addressing stereotypes is hard. In your own life, at your Thanksgiving table or your Christmas table with your homophobic uncle, or in a sexist workplace with a racist boss. We do understand. So as part of our Say Nothing, Change Nothing campaign, we created the Unstereotype 101 guide because we want to empower people to feel safe to speak up. It's aimed at Gen Z, but it can be used by anyone, so please do grab the QR code and check it out. You can also use it for training exercises with your teams or employees. But if we're ever going to address the Gen Z paradox and close the gender divide that's throwing this demographic into reverse, frankly, there are a few things you need to think about as advertisers, as content creators, as employers, as responsible communicators. Reject the expected. And stereotypical portrayals are exactly that, right? They're expected, and they have been done to death. Open the aperture on your brand view of the world. Reflect that back to your Gen Z consumers. Surprise them. Be brave. Create new visual narratives and new stories of success. You have an opportunity to engage young men by creating positive depictions of healthy masculinities, yes, plural, at scale, and it's urgently needed. Allow them to show emotion, to change expression, to have friendships and healthy relationships, to be vulnerable. Show diverse depictions of beauty, of aspirational life goals, of love across the gender spectrum in more dynamic and innovative ways. Introduce new role models and be super intentional with your brand partnerships, including the influencers you engage with. Because when authentic brand and influencer partnerships are built, when you introduce more interesting role models, diverse messaging starts to emerge into the world. Your consumers feel seen and represented with authenticity, which leads to new and inspiring conversations that will benefit your brand as well. And finally, ensure that diverse Gen Z voices, are at the table and that they're heard. Nothing about us without us is a feminist mantra that frankly still falls on deaf ears, but when it comes to your Gen Z consumer audiences, ignore it at your peril. Who makes the work is who shows up in the work, right? And if your brand is to speak with any authenticity, you need representation from across Gen Z on your team, every colour, religion, and every stop on the gender spectrum of the communities you serve. And if your agency team does not reflect this diversity, insist upon it. You should not walk into another presentation where there is either no diversity or token diversity around the table. Insist upon it up front when you pitch your account as part of your annual planning criteria and build it into briefs. Because change comes from where the money comes from. You have a right and a responsibility to dictate the terms of doing business with your brand. So that is our challenge to you, and where we ask for your help to drive the change we all need to see, which you have the power and the influence to create for the health of all generations, for the fight for gender equality, and for the progress of the marketing industry. Thank you.